Hi guys and girls, I'm your host Phillip J. Watt and welcome to the Redesigning Society podcast. Today's guest is Gordon White, and for those who aren't familiar with Gordon's work, he is an author of the Rune Soup blog and has an associated podcast, Rune Soup. You'll find that on iTunes and all our other podcast apps. He's an author of 3 books as well, The Chaos Protocols, Magical Techniques for Navigating the New Economic Reality, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, and Pieces of 8, Chaos, Magic, Essays, and Enchantments. And as you can tell, he has a huge focus on magic, the paranormal, its cultural implications, and pretty much anything that's a little bit weird in terms of how we experience life as a human at the start of the 21st century. I'll do a quick summary of his Rune Soup blog. He's written on his site. It is about practical sorcery, ethnogens, I couldn't pronounce that word there for a second, synchronicities, UFOs, alternative history, career guidance, graphic novels, the future of media, probability, divination. So it's all exciting, weird stuff. It's a great series of areas and topics to explore the mind and really think about how we can expand our consciousness into the way that we interact with our world. He's also a presenter. He does workshops. His recent one was up in the Blue Mountains in the beautiful western area of Sydney. And he has an online course in chaos magic for anybody who is interested in getting a little bit more hands-on knowledge for how to practice magic personally, and also to see how others are doing it in this day and age. So welcome to the Redesigning Society podcast, Gordon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mate, I'm a huge fan. Your capacity to objectively analyse what's going on in terms of both theory and practice in our current age is phenomenal. I have huge respect. I might not always agree with your position, but I certainly have huge respect for your just genuine nature of really trying to explore what is happening, what the human's experience really is about. A lot of these topics that you focus on are basically put into the bullshit basket or the superstition basket by mainstream materialist minions, and that's a good sign, because if people who believe in the robotic sort of definition of life think that is too weird, then you're clearly on the right path. Gordon, I know that you ask every person on your podcast an initial question, and which is, were you a weird kid? And I do want to ask you that. But before I do, I just thought I'd look up the definition of weird, because sometimes we sort of forget some of the intricacies of these words. And the first definition on dictionary.com is involving or suggesting the supernatural, unearthly, or uncanny. And am I right to think that you put the word weird in that because, with your initial question, the word weird, because it does sort of relate to supernatural experience?
It does. That's a bit of an Easter egg that I don't think anyone's asked before. But even earlier than that, if you look at the etymology of the word weird, it emerges from kind of Germanic and Northern European culture, weird, spelt with a Y, to do with the role of fate or the spirits in the kind of weaving or bending of one's life. So to describe a path as weird or to describe a person as weird, they're in some sense touched by, moved along, or implicated by spirits and fate. So when I ask if someone's a weird kid, some people will say no, some people don't. It's really fun when they say no, and then they start to tell me incidents in their childhood that were formative on their development, and they get about halfway through and realize, oh goodness, I actually was in fact a weird kid. Because that's the sort of secret subtext. If you end up on a podcast like Rune Soup, I can confidently say you are weird because you've done something that I found inspirational. You've done research into Paleolithic medicine, or you're a anthropologist working with indigenous Tibetans or whatever it happens to be. And so by my definition, or by the secret subtext, which you've picked up on there, Phil, yes, the word is deliberate, and they are all weird kids.
Yeah, I think it's quite common just to think about it as abnormal, which I did myself. You know, it's were you normal or were you abnormal? Were you just that normal or weirdness? So that's why I thought I'd have a look, and it's amazing how we get lost in some of the semantics or the meanings of these sorts of words. So, all right, Gordon. So let's assume, and based on that definition, really, I think all kids were weird. A lot of us get suppressed in our weirdness, and now we get told that things aren't real, or it's just put in that superstition basket, as I said earlier, and then they sort of get trained or conditioned into the status quo, and they lose that capacity and they lose those experiences. So in that context, like I'll give you a perfect example. My younger brother, I remember he was about 8, and he said to me, Phil, this is when I must have been about 20. He said, when I see the cricket ball moving through the air, before I see it, I see a blue line of energy, and I know exactly where it's going to go, Phil. Is that real? And I said, well, look, most people are going to tell you that you're seeing things, but what I'll say is that that's an experience that you're having. And if you allow yourself to remain open to those sorts of experiences, you'll very much continue having those experiences for the rest of your life. But if you pretend right now that it's not real, even though you're literally seeing it, then it's going to end up with that experience being suppressed. So, Gordon, let's assume you were a weird kid. How were you a weird kid?
A number of ways, I suppose. So I hit some linguistic and reading milestones fairly early. So I was speaking at a typically younger age than people were. The consequence of that was that I could read precociously at sort of double my age. I didn't understand a lot of it, of course, but I read Lord of the Rings independently for the first time at 6, and that kind of, when I look back on it, obviously a 6-year-old mind reading Tolkien, it probably had a long-term influence on that kind of mushy development, which wouldn't be surprising given that I'm a lifelong Tolkien fan and I've been to his grave multiple times and so on when I was living in the UK. So I think there's a component of it there. Additionally, in fact, although I live in the Hawkesbury at the moment, I'm back in my birth town of Newcastle, and I'm staying with my parents, and I'm in my mother's meditation room because it's the quietest room in the house, and there are about 1,000 crystals and big statues and so on in here, which means there is some kind of lineage component to my interest in this stuff. Mother's been an energy healer for decades, and when she was single, she would do things like live in haunted houses and got quite good at automatic writing. And whilst I was never tutored in any of that kind of stuff, when it did emerge, it emerged in a sympathetic environment. And as a result, there are some kind of paranormal experiences that have happened over the course of my early childhood, seeing weird coconut spirits in Fiji on one particular trip, and the kind of classic things that everyone listening to this probably has to do with sibling telepathy and telephone telepathy and all those kind of things going on, and some sort of posthumous encounters with my maternal grandfather, that kind of stuff growing up. The sort of things that do typically, if you let them, kind of like your story with your brother, if you just let the experience emerge rather than analyze it to say this is real or this is not real, they do tend to grow better over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's when you're talking about your experience as a kid, then it reminded me of an experience I had when my partner, who I've known for over 20 years, 24 years, something like that, we were together at an early age, but we knew each other as kids. And she was a little magical fairy, a little magical queen from a very early age, very naturally wise person who decided to, in the spirit of witchery, sew some of my hair when I cut it off when I was quite young into her pillow. So I was introduced to that sort of weirdness and seances through her, but I certainly certainly didn't experience through just general. I didn't have lucid dreams until my late teens. I didn't experience these sorts of weirdness until I became a little bit older. But yeah, so as a kid, I was certainly abnormal and the lone wolf on many levels, but I certainly wasn't experiencing anything like that. But all right, so your podcast is about magic. One of its primary areas is focusing on magic. What is it? How to practice it? What's its historic context? What's its modern context? All that sort of good stuff. So let's start from the start, Gordon. From your perspective, what is magic?
Yeah, I have this definition down to a refined sentence now that I then subsequently explain, which is magic is a culture-specific way of using or interacting with the natural consciousness capacities of a particular human. So that might sound a bit circular, but actually if you look across the world at systems or cultures that have never repudiated magic in the same way that the Northwest European Enlightenment did, and I'd be very specific about that in Europe because you actually find in Southern Europe that it's carried on merrily in the kind of folk traditions of Italian grandmothers and so on. But it's that very specific Cartesian post-Enlightenment world out of all of human history that repudiated it. But if you look around the world, there are sort of what you might call quote-unquote magical powers, for want of a less dramatic term, a number of techniques that are reasonably conserved. So you have some method of seeing the future, or clairvoyance. You have some method of communicating across distance. So you have telepathy or whatever you want to call it. These are just modern words for capacities, right? And then you have interacting with or communicating with the spirit world. And then you have some method as a result of that, typically of what I would call probability enhancement or probability manipulation, which is to make the things that you want happen more often than the things that you don't want to happen. And that pretty much covers in all its dizzying and exciting variety around the world, that pretty much covers what people have and do use magic for throughout time. What's interesting to me about that is if you look at the history of, say, the development of Psi and the Society for Psychical Research and all these kind of groups that emerged about 150 years ago, we now have 150 years of evidence from mostly laboratory evidence that basically falls neatly into these four categories, which rather suggests that it is, in fact, it's a conserved human capacity, which says something very profound, I would suggest, about the nature of reality and the role of the human within it.
So these natural capacities have no doubt been suppressed through postmodern modernism, the dogmatic sort of evolution of materialist science and materialist philosophy, and just general consumerism and materialism, and just that approach to dealing with value when it comes to things outside of us, money, power, etc. So do you think that not only have those natural capacities been suppressed, but do you think we've got the capability of evolving new capacities?
I presume so, absolutely. There's, it's not necessarily scientific evidence, but you do find that there are, much like anything else, much like tennis or anything, if you do something over time, you get better at it, particularly if there's a sort of feedback loop component to it. So that's kind of where we're at today in the sort of Western recovery of essentially the magical or whatever you want to call it, because you get some really remarkable incidents. Mother, who I just mentioned, has spent some time, was fortunate enough to spend time with Australian Aboriginal tribes in the sort of centre of Australia doing women's mystery stuff. And in one particular instance, I can tell this story. I asked beforehand because I don't use names or anything. But they were there, they arrived, and an elder had died the day before. And so that night, out of the night, all these old women who had been walking for 3 days to come for essentially the funeral showed up. Now that means two things. They left before he died, without telephones or anything, and they showed up in time for the funeral. And this was normal. This is a normal thing that happens. And that is I think that tells us where we can go once we individually and culturally normalize this stuff. You actually find in the mid-20th century there's been a few anthropologists who looked at the role of magic in Italy and Brazil and so on, and they come to the conclusion that magic works better in cultures that have a belief in magic. That tells you something really interesting about how it might work and how we might make it work better.
Are you referring to like the biology of belief that's put forward by, his name slips my mind at the moment. I'll have to get back to you on that, but that collective belief enhances those capacities?
It might be that. It's anthropological and historical research rather than biological. So it might be that, or that might be a expression of that same function manifesting in biology. The thing is, at the moment, we don't know, right? We just happen to know that places like Brazil have much more people have experiences of better spirit and magical effects right up to UFO encounters than much more materialistic or sort of scientistic cultures. And that is an area that we should think about, and maybe in a few decades hence, when this stuff is easier to talk about and get funding for, probably fund some research on.
Yeah, the name I was thinking of was Bruce Lipton. He wrote The Biology of Belief and talks about epigenetics and how the belief capacity can help to create or generate a particular state of mind or body, including with healing and stuff like that. But yeah, going back to the original peoples, not just Australia, but worldwide, ancient civilizations, ancient cultures, I've been a long-term fan of reinvigorating some of the philosophical and practical components of these original cultures in our modern age, particularly around values, community, but also connection, spirit, and all those other good aspects of thinking and feeling. And yeah, there's just so much we can learn from these ancient civilizations, and that's just a beautiful story, because you hear anecdotally these things all the time, and there it is right in front of you. They left before this person died. They were somehow able to intuitively tap in to that moment going to happen, and they arrived for the time of the funeral. So beautiful story.
Especially it's normal. That's the bit that I think we miss, because that's when people listening to the show, and this is what I find, I don't want to go as far as frustrating, but what I guess continues to surprise me about the modern West is 90% of people have had a telephone telepathy experience. About 75% of people will admit to having a spirit communication experience, typically when after a loved one has died, and you list it and go, so the majority of us are having these experiences, which makes them normal. And it's just this one tiny fragment of population in time, estimated to be about 5% of the total Earth's population right now for the last 100 years, that thinks this stuff doesn't exist. Meanwhile, we're having these experiences, and everyone around the world continues to have them because they haven't had that Cartesian Enlightenment materialist head trauma. And that's the bit that I think, for me, when Mother told me the story, that's incredible. It's incredible because it's normal. That's the presence of a mobile phone in these cultures. It's just, so-and-so is about to make her journey to, the post-death state. It's a 3-day walk. I better get going. And that's just normal, and that's wonderful. And it is normal. That's kind of the point. These materialist premises have been repeatedly falsified. It's wrong. So we can't be in this kind of state for all that long when the people who are opposed to us are wrong. They're actually fundamentally, presuppositionally incorrect. And that's, I guess, what's so exciting about where we are, I guess, at this point in the timeline, where people kind of know that. And in fact, you get to turn around and I do this, obviously, you get to turn around and browbeat people who would dare express this scientific rather nonsense. Well, that's not correct. And then you find, and I've done this over, a 20-year or more career of magic, if you do this rudely, because, if I'm intoxicated or whatever at a dinner party, the more people that I've noticed over the last 10 years, more people end up on your side than on the other side. So we're actually at a stage where we can start to have these discussions because the people who are trying to, or the people who would dismiss these discussions are provably wrong.
Yeah, it was a bit of a cult there for quite some time, and the arrogance associated with it was phenomenal. It's unbelievable the types of conversations I've had with people who are so convicted around these truths or false truths. And it does seem to be loosening up a bit, because I think as more people get in touch with themselves and their experiences and being honest about their experience, that they're going to be open and say, well, hang on, it sort of doesn't fit that materialist model.
It's the arrogance that gives me personal license, because otherwise I try to be polite to people in general. But it's the arrogance that gives me free rein to be a bit nastier than I otherwise already would if we were disagreeing about, I don't know, some kind of minor foreign policy issue. But if it's when they show up with the 19th century waistcoated imperial dickhead superstition position, and it's wrong, and if anyone does that, stomp.
Yeah, it's good to be. I like to drop truth bombs. I try and do it as compassionately, but sometimes compassionately as possible. But I like to also be blunt and direct, and just completely say it as a matter of fact. And I hope that you want to listen to it instead of try and put forward silly rebuttals that don't I'm not going to listen to or believe in. So. Okay, you talked about, let's just quickly touch on that. Materialism has been debunked. In what ways would you say it has?
It's a very good point. So its foundational premises are and have always been false. The foundational premise is that there is nothing but material. So anything that doesn't have an atom doesn't exist. Now, it's been repeatedly ruined, particularly over the 20th century. It was ruined initially with, the appearance of essentially quantum theory, which shows that, in fact, not even atoms have a reliable physical presence, but also that there is a kind of quantum entanglement effect. We don't know what this is. It was also, I think, more interestingly ruined in the 70s with the rise of parts of postmodernism and post-structuralism, where it became apparent that materialism was this imperial ad campaign that relied on a kind of dead, inert machine Earth and everyone having superstition and so on, that allowed the kind of push of scientism and the expansion of empire and so on. But the foundational premise is false, and it's particularly false when you're arguing with materialists, because even on the chalkboard, they can't demonstrate how a molecule can have interiority. They can't demonstrate how, if you are nothing but material, you are sitting there in some form of conscious capacity arguing about the fact that you don't have consciousness. Like it's caught in this absurd loop, and all the little fudges that they try to kind of make it work like it's an epiphenomena, that's a non-material thing, and it's also a guess, and it's a guess that they use to hold the idea that matter is still dead within it. Same thing with panpsychism, where you essentially have, consciousness is a little component of a molecule, and if you stack enough of them together like Lego blocks, you get a mind. That also doesn't work, because you have complex molecular structures without mind, and you also have less complex brains that demonstrate, for instance, the octopus, that demonstrate unbelievable levels of conscious capacity compared to animals with larger minds or larger brains that don't. So it fails every time. From the foundational premise, you're arguing a conscious position that you don't have consciousness. It's ludicrous. It actually just does not work.
Yeah, and then I guess there's that whole observer effect and the evolution of the double split experiment as well, how they've been able to show that time is another construct, and that it can have an effect outside of the space-time continuum.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right, I'll just backtrack a little bit, because you said something about, you said that it's quite normal to have these telephone telepathies and all these other weird experiences, which really is a divine dichotomy, isn't it? Because if it's both weird, i.e. supernatural in essence, but it's quite normal, then that's another beautiful representation of duality in our modern world. But to move back to you talk about one component of magic is enhancing probabilities, and let's unpack that a little bit, because I'm not sure if people would have understood that. So that's a big part of my practice. I don't really have so much of these telepathies, and my intuition's not exactly that great. My Aries on Libra moon philosophical force field is really that lone wolf energy, and it takes me a lot of work to become conscious of the energies that I'm absorbing around me, because I've got this natural deflection process. But when it comes to creating what I want, I'm not successful a lot of the time. A lot of magical practitioners aren't successful a lot of the time at getting what they want. And my take on that is, there's three layers of the mind that I see: the conscious, the unconscious, or the subconscious, and also the universal consciousness. You can call that the collective unconscious with Jung's work, or you can go in a step further. I think you call that the 10,000 foot view, where it's just consciousness in and of itself. But there's this energetic layer that I've noticed in my experience, which drives the manifestation of it. I.e., I was born in this particular time, in this particular place, with these particular parents, and then these sort of synchronistic, sort of symbolic sort of experiences unfolded around that energetic blueprint. And that's the primary driver of my manifestation and creation. But then there's the subconscious, including traumas and good wiring. That's a huge aspect of the mind, obviously, that manifest the world around us. It's such a huge driver, and personally, I've had to go back into it to do healing and development of that, to make sure that it's manifesting in accordance with what I want consciously. And then there's the conscious layer of the mind, which is such a small aspect, but it can have a huge impact on the subconscious and just the general manifestation and creation of our experience. So is that why, from my point of view, I would say that it's hard to always manifest what you want, because there's the subconscious and the energetic layers that are more strong. But if you can align your conscious mind with those, then you're co-creating in that space. Does that make sense? Do you think that's why probabilistic sort of creation is sort of hindered by these other layers?
It may well be. To some extent, I don't care, in the sense that, like, from a chaos magic perspective, you get explanations are not as interesting as ways of improving results, right? And particularly ways of improving results. So why I call it probabilistic enhancement is as follows. Now, you can kind of picture this, if you're listening, as even though it's a debunked model, you can kind of picture this as a sort of food pyramid. So on the base of it, we have the understanding that the universe itself is probabilistic. That's what, that is the great quantum revelation, which is essentially physical things are only there in a probabilistic sense, particularly and only when we look at them. So if you're not looking at something, it's not that it's in a probabilistic field. It's not a physical component. Now you move that up to the next level, which is in some way, then the human mind is implicated in the continued existence of existence. Right. And so moving further up the pyramid, then you layer in some of the more interesting psi results and parapsychology results that I think have implications on this. For instance, Dr. Dean Radin's work around Burning Man, where he would use random number generators and get large groups of people to think of a particular idea, and it would actually respond. The random number generator would respond, which sort of suggests that multiple minds, or human minds, have an ability to influence the random. Next level up, you have Dr. Darrell Bem, who did precognitive research to do with things like sexual imagery, so that you're essentially, quote unquote, more likely to predict the future or feel the future if it is in some way embodied. The experiment was you would the people who were sitting for the experiment would have a screen that was covered by a curtain, and it would either be a pornographic or sexually explicit image or not. And it was easier for people to predict the sexually explicit ones. And the conclusion there is you're in some sense feeling the future state where you have a physiological reaction to the sexually explicit image. So you stack these things together and you go, all right, so the universe is probabilistic. The human mind has provable impact on the probabilistic nature of the universe. So when it comes to assessing its impact on trying to get things you want, which is probability enhancement, the way I look at it is purely numbers. So you cast you go and find a hoodoo spell for winning the lottery. And there's a way of saying that every single enchantment works because your chances of winning the lottery are 1 in 280 million. And let's say you're extremely good at magic and you can halve probabilities. So you've used magic on the lottery to move your odds from 1 in 280 million to 1 in 140 million. You're still not going to win the lottery. Now, if you are looking at things that have a 2 or a 1 in 3 chance of happening, they are excellent targets for probability enhancement. So part of what we do as premium members, the first course in particular to do with sigil magic, was spend a lot of time thinking about what goals and targets you would like to subject to enhancement. Because based on the premise, and it is a premise, I'm just sort of saying this, that magic always works, and it probably does because it's a function of human consciousness. The goal then is to find which probability or which areas of probability can be subject to the least change, and that really alters your strategy through life. Because if you want something, and you can want the big things, you just break it into bigger goals and go at them. So if you want to live somewhere else in a completely different career, you want to live on the other side of the country in a completely different career, magic is definitely for you. But if you just, throw a sigil at a wall for that particular outcome, you might have moved the probabilities, but not in a sufficient way to make the likelihood of it happening happen.
Yeah, it's I guess what I was saying with my my experience of trying to intentionally create or manipulate my experience to get what I want. Sometimes the soul energy or energetic blueprint energy says, "Nah, that's not your destiny. We're going somewhere else." So sometimes I don't feel conscious enough to understand what I actually want or need.
This, in some respects, there's an attitude to magic, particularly chaos magic, which is almost a shut up and calculate attitude, which is you make the decision to operate in what we would consider the real world, which is a world of gods and spirits and so on. You make the decision to operate in it, but you also assert your own sovereignty to take charge of bringing the results into your life. Where it kind of fails as a macro metaphysics very often is that, as you just said, the role of the suprahuman, whatever you want to call it, divine mind, God, what have you, is always going to be stronger and is always there. And at least part of the kind of trick is to work out and feel where it's sort of moving you or pushing you through life. And as it does that, you can use magic to enhance the bits kind of around the sides. But absolutely, it's kind of, even though a magical universe is one that has some form of God in it, whatever you want to call it, you almost operate as if God isn't there. And that, funnily enough, I learned that from Tolkien when people were kind of saying maybe Lord of the Rings isn't that Catholic, because he was up and down Catholic his entire life. He said his Catholicism is on every page. And it's on every page because you have to act as if God does not play a role in your life. You have to make decisions, so fighting evil or whatever it is. You have to act as if the ultimate decision isn't up to God, even though it actually is. And it could be because God is achieving what it wants by your actions or not. But he said, my Catholicism is on every page. You act as if God isn't the ultimate end of what gets to happen, even though it is.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. It's one of those things, like sometimes you get those synchronicities and go, oh, that's where the flow's sort of going, and then I just feel tricked about it and go, oh shit, that you got me. That was not the right
Yeah. It's not a well, this is why weird works, right? So what you've just described is what the original term of weird, as in that kind of winding movement of fate through people's lives. It's not a genie's lamp. Unfortunately, you don't just get to go to it and go, I would like this now, please. It moves you where it's going to move you, and it's usually right. Or in fact, I haven't had an experience where it hasn't been. It's been, I'm sure it's the same for you. It's been my misinterpretation of what's going on. It's usually right, but it also seems to have, or at least it looks like to us, a very specific sense of humor.
Yes, yeah, and that's true. The interpretation process is a big process that we need to really honour and respect, because a lot of people get stuck in their intuitive sort of beliefs and get very rigid about the information that comes through their instinct and intuition. But let's face it, we're all wrong a lot of the time. And if we remember that as we go through our experience, we're more likely to remain open and to openness also to that flow. I just want to go back a little bit, because you talked about the group meditation, and we've all heard that story where people, a huge amount of meditators, meditated on decreasing crime. I think it was in New York City over a particular winter. I don't know if that's absolutely true. I've heard the story. I don't know if that is based on real data. But can you just talk a little bit about that? Because we look out into the animal kingdom, we see birds. They sort of fly to, big flocks of birds fly together, and it looks like the communication is so instant that it's beyond the space-time, speed of light sort of continuum. And so they're communicating on some non-local level. But also bees, ants, it's this colony type organism, the superorganism that sort of operates together. And you could probably look at humans the same. So how effective is a collection of human minds working together to receive results, and what sort of data and researchers might people want to look into to see sort of those results?
Sure. Well, it's a really good example of how even people who might be listening to this and think, "Oh, I'm not a materialist," we still tend to have these discussions at the other end of the collapse of materialism without looking at those foundational premises again. So people will start using words like mind over matter, which is impossible. That's what happens when you come out of the Cartesian split. So Descartes said mind is wholly separate from matter, and it's essentially a theological argument. He gave mind to God, and he gave dead matter as a kind of machine universe to, scientism. And then in the 19th century, they just got rid of mind/God. And so we've just been left with this dead robot universe, which is wrong. And as a result, in all the biological sciences, really interesting stuff is happening in biology and plant biology to do with the realization that rather than being dead or essentially robots, they have agency. So they will actually, think and transform within a generation, rather than that kind of slow mutation of the clock, which you get in that kind of early Darwinism. So when you look at, and these are very good examples, when you're looking at bees, when you're looking at, the movements of birds and so on, what it shows is the failure of the kind of analytical framework that we have brought to understand life in general. And when you realize that, you kind of turn around and look at these group experiences and go, well, it should be expected. I mean, animals know things like when an earthquake's going to happen. Dogs, and Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's done great work on dogs knowing when their owners come home and all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of what I mean by, in the definition of magic, it has to be natural. There is no such thing as a supernatural. So it's a natural consciousness component. Now, when you're talking about group or even distant effects on reality, my favorite research is probably Dr. Elizabeth Targ's prayer research. So she did research on the impact of group prayer on people who are dying of AIDS, and people who either didn't know they were being prayed for or knew they were being prayed for, and also groups that didn't believe in prayer and so on. And the results for people who are being prayed for, there's the sort of the actual healing results were astonishing, to the point where it's kind of one of those experiments that you have to stop because the results are so good that it's actually not fair on the control group that isn't being prayed for. So wherever you look, you will find these pieces. And I think the challenge in 2017 is because we have a mountain of them. We have a mountain of, peer-reviewed research that shows that that says something quite important about our understanding of reality. I think the challenge in the next few years is to go, okay, how do we make all these allegedly anomalous results normal? And it comes back to where we are now, which is the adjustment of that kind of macro or the presuppositional worldview, because we still haven't, even people who are, into this stuff like us, as a group, our descriptions of reality that allow for these things to happen aren't up to code. And it kind of comes back to that idea of, cultures that have a belief in magic get better magical effects. So we sort of have a belief, and it's something Pete Carroll, who founded Chaos Magic, said: magic works in practice, but not in theory. So we all know it works in practice. And now it's time to kind of really get at the bones of those presuppositions and kind of break them apart and reform them. But in terms of group magical effects and the impact of kind of groups having consciousness on it, William Tiller and Elizabeth Targ, if people are listening, go and look into their stuff.
Yeah, well said. I want to reiterate Dean Radin as well, and Rupert Sheldrake's work. I interviewed them on season 1 of this podcast, and Dean Radin's work in particular has shown pretty consistent, statistically significant results when it comes to psi phenomena for those who are interested, who are more analytically minded or want a rationale for understanding how these effects are taking place in the lab. So I really recommend going and checking out their work. All right, let's get on to what are some various practices of magic, Gordon. So I know that you're a chaos magician. I would sort of probably relate to that myself. Can you explain what that is and what other... I mean, my experience of magic is I have an intention to manipulate my experience for sometimes selfish means and sometimes more collective means. And that's where my experience with neo-shamanism comes into that collective aspect. But if we do it for primarily selfish purposes, and especially if it's at the expense of other people, would that be considered like a type of dark magic or a black magic? What is the spectrum of magic and the spectrum of magical practice?
Sure. Well, to make it kind of concise, we will talk about magic as we understand it in the kind of Northwest European context. So you can make the case, and most kind of scholars in this field do, that what we might recognize as magic in the Western world, so circles and angels and using different sort of calling in different god names to either attract or direct spirits and that kind of stuff, emerged in Alexandria in the classical world, which at the time was, Greco-Egyptian and then subsequently Roman, and it had a Jewish population of possibly up to a third. So in this Eastern Mediterranean blend, you have a mix of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, kind of Egyptian ideas. Alexandria was where the Old Testament was first translated into Greek. So this kind of way of seeing the world is formational on the subsequent, I guess, theology and metaphysics of Europe. Now, it kind of survived in different ways, first in Byzantium and then with the sort of fall of Constantinople in through Italy and up as a general system of, because of where man sits in a biblical understanding of the universe as being kind of above devils and in some respect, particularly if you're a priest, like God's representative on earth, you have a universal ability to... You can speak with God's authority to kind of direct spirits and angels because of how man was conceptualized in this framework. So that as a system is maybe its descriptions aren't very good. So we would probably go, I'm not sure if I like how the biblical conception of man is. I'm not sure if that's a good map for how we might want to see the world in the 21st century. But if you take that bit out and away, what you have is... a human, male or female, so it's not a gendered thing, that has some capacity to interact. I call it extra-dimensional diplomacy. It has some capacity to interact with a spirit world to get whatever it is they happen to want. So there's not necessarily, there are historic moral judgments about whether you use them for nefarious purposes or not, so that you kind of have this post-Latin word malefica, which is essentially curse magic, which was very common. Things like the evil eye and so on. It was very common amongst the non-literate classes in European history that there are always different ways you could, ruin your neighbor's crops or something using malefica. And it was probably used more than I think people realize. Arguably, especially when you look at things like the witch trials and so on, there was a bit of hysteria about its presence. But magic is amoral in the literal sense, as in without morality. It doesn't mean people use amoral to mean to do something nasty, but it means without morality. Anecdotally, having done this for a few decades and knowing a bunch of operative magicians, you do, and I'm sure you would have experienced this yourself, Phil, if you encounter the real, as in if you have real spiritual experiences, you find yourself less and less inclined to get jealous and get angry at petty things and be so like lame as to try and cause harm to someone in general, but let alone with magic. So whilst it technically, and it has historically certainly been used for different things like that and kind of negative stuff, people around the world kill each other with magic all the time. So you can do it. But because it's kind of baked into a spiritual quest, the better you get at magic, the less inclined you are to want to do stuff like that.
Yeah, it's. I think that philosophy of connection, or the experience of connection, can really help emancipate people from wanting to do harm to others, because there's a sense of doing harm to yourself if you do so. But then when you've got particular ideological frameworks, such as Satanism or Luciferianism or whatever it may be, that is more selfishness based, that's where there can be, I guess, a good, well experienced capacity to practice magic, but it's done so in a negative way, or in a way that causes harm.
You also find, because you can make the case, and I think you should, that curses are not always bad. So if you look at cultures that have a strong and living tradition of people specializing in black magic, so Afro-Caribbean traditions and so on, their historical experience over the last 300 years has not been very good. And so you have no recourse to law. You have no recourse to a kind of blind system of justice that we potentially have. Well, theoretically, we have a less sighted system of justice, right? So if you are if you find in suppressed groups the people being very good at curse magic, it's because they can't. If they get their stuff stolen, or their niece is raped by the plantation owner, who are they going to tell? The police? And so there are cases where cursing isn't universally bad. But if you're in a developed country in the 21st century, and a stable one as we currently are, Phil, it's probably not. I wouldn't recommend it. Let's say that.
Yeah. All right. So let's track back to that original question, chaos magic, because you talk about cultural specific experience of natural capacities of consciousness, and that's why I guess some people who are religious have experiences of, Catholic have experiences of the Catholic God, and then there's the other cultural or religious doctrines that experience their own experience of gods, then angels, demons, plants, so it's what's happening, I guess, in the mind and the neurology that can help filter the experience in a way that's relatable to that particular person. And that's what chaos magic in a sense is, isn't it? It's about adapting you or using all models or methodologies or practices to suit whatever it is in your particular moment. Is that a okay definition?
Yeah, chaos magic emerged in the mid-'80s in North London, a group of practicing occultists, principally Pete Carroll. He's written some of the defining texts on it. And it adopts as its... And what you have to understand about, I guess, magic in Thatcher's Britain at the time, coming out of the 70s, and with some kind of really inside baseball arguments and collapses of sort of thelemic style orders, is that there's this kind of mess where you have this wash up of 70s astrological dream catcher nonsense, and also the sort of Crowleyan line of magic had it's just fighting amongst themselves, as magical orders always do. And they're kind of like, well, this is real, and they adopted the idea that belief can be used as a tool. So there is a single belief, which is a meta sort of meta empiricism, that there may not be an ultimate truth, but different beliefs may improve the physical outcomes of our practical enchantment. And then they sort of subsequently went and experimented with them, and it retains that experimental mode, which is, in the 90s, once, dial-up internet happened and chaos magic escaped to the US, there's this kind of idea of, can you call Superman rather than Apollo in an Apollonian sort of solar spell and have it work? And you can, and it works. It does probably, like the next phase, the last 10 years of chaos magic do suggest that it works better if you use Apollo rather than Superman. But that was its kind of, it was hyper practical to begin with. It started with the intent to experiment and find what works and capitalize on what works. And that's its tremendous strength, but also its potentially its weakness, because it doesn't lead in the end, as postmodernism and empiricism in general does. It doesn't really lead to a particularly satisfying or nuanced worldview. So people tend to go through, I've stuck with it because you dance with the one what brung you, but people tend to go through a chaos magic phase, which allows them to kind of de-pattern almost out of whatever the belief system they're emerging from. And then they do, as a result of the experiments, tend to find something they like and move into that direction and kind of live there instead. But that's its general idea. It's that belief is a tool. There might not be an ultimate reality, because if you're trying to do magic in the mid-'80s, you had this Kabbalistic correspondences and some messed up 70s astrology, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And it all just seemed like the nonsense that it is. And it was just have a go at it, see what works, keep it.
Yeah, well, as long as that sort of place that you settle in doesn't lead into, I guess, dogma and closing ourselves off to whatever potential we might still be yet to reach. All right, talking about worldviews, I think you call it big table animism from memory, but you're talking in discussion with your sort of, I can't remember, elite members.
Premium members.
Premium members, yes. About what is the worldview that sort of captures this experience right now. And so and you've sort of come to this animism, or gone back to what you described as the most dominant philosophy throughout the course of human experience, of human civilization. So what is animism? And how can it explain magic?
Well, it's I call it big table animism because even in the New Age, or almost especially in the New Age, in the 21st century, you have these belief systems, meta ones, so models or metaphysics that are allowed to sit at the adults' table. Materialism, which is wrong. The soul for materialism, which is idealism, thus all is mind, and the fact that you can't notice that is a mental error, and thus you live in an illusory world. That one's wrong. But these two are allowed to sit at the table as complete descriptions of reality, right down to the molecular or submolecular level, or so on. Animism, which is admittedly, like, this is a 18th century German term used to deployed in that kind of racist colonial context to describe cultures that essentially had beliefs in spirits and so on. But in the modern academic concept, animism is the extension of personhood outside of the human. Because as we just sort of mentioned that Cartesian head trauma that led us to split mind and matter, and also consider the rest of the living world essentially a clock, literally a clock, with no ghost or anything and no spirit in it. And then you have the spirit, the ghost in the machine, and that's just as bad, and so on. Animism says that a tree is a person. It's not a human, but it's a person. And it says the spirits are persons. And so you have a different perspective of how you interact with your local environment, both physical and non-physical, that comes from this simple act of extending personhood beyond the human. And I know everyone thinks they do that, but how many times have you heard people say he thinks he's people or she thinks she's people about their pet? She is people, all right? Leave it alone. However, there are necessary implications, like in terms of describing reality as a metaphysics, that flow from this way of seeing the world, that I think, even if it's not right, I think it belongs at the big table with the other ones. And I just kind of smell that suspicion of the spirit world in it. And I think it describes reality better because it allows for UFO phenomena and spirits and Fortean effects and so on in a way that the other ones don't. You can kind of get them with idealism, which is that kind of new age, all is mind notion, and you're just in error in not understanding it, and it's an illusion, and the goal is to overcome the illusion. Quite how that works, because surely the experience of overcoming the illusion is also an illusion. Never mind. So you have these faulty versions of describing reality sitting at a table, and we have this original one. And here's why the original thing is interesting to me. Around in Europe, you have, particularly from the Renaissance on, when they rediscovered all these classical texts, your Plato, your Hermeticism, and so on, they thought that maybe there was a prisca theologia, so an original perfect belief system that we as humans had fallen away from. And of course, because it's the Renaissance, they pictured it as some kind of Platonic, Christian, Hermetic, pure state where we all kind of lived in this connection to the one, and as a result of the fall and the flood and so on, this kind of tumbled down and became debased. Now, that's wrong, historically, fine, but there's something about the idea that there was an original way that humans on Earth experienced and interacted with the rest of the universe, that we're like, we all have the feeling of like, we're not in it. I know it's there and we're not in it. Now, almost a bit dramatically, but if there is what Aldous Huxley would call a perennial philosophy, or the prisca theologia, like this original belief system, if that's true, if that feeling is true, then it's animism, because that's historically our first way of interacting with the world. It's this idea of spirits and the dream world being absolutely real and journeying and all this kind of stuff. It's that's the original one that we've fallen away from. So if that's kind of what I mean by big table animism, I want the world to realize that it can describe reality as well as, if not better, than the ones that we typically allow to sit at the big people's table, because I think it does.
So the implication from that is that we're separate sort of beings or separate consciousnesses. But you also talk about the 10,000 foot view, where we are all of the experience, including potentially, the interaction with spirits, could be all part of my mind or the one mind. So the question becomes, we know we're interdependent ecologically. Do you see an interdependence or interconnection with humans, with the rest of the universe and the spirit world? And if so, what would be the mechanism? What is the mechanism? Because a lot of people talk about consciousness, especially because of the observer effect collapsing potentiality into particles of experience. So where does consciousness and connection fit into animism?
Well, firstly, is an ecosystem one thing, or is it many things? So that's kind of what I mean by the 10,000 foot view. Clearly, animism is the extension of ecosystemic thinking into like the non-physical, into the spirit world. When the next step down, and you kind of did it a couple of times there, which is why I think it needs to sit at the table and have its own words, is what is consciousness then? So there isn't an Australian Aboriginal word for consciousness, because even as we frame the double slit experiments or the Schrodinger's cat experiments or any of that stuff as consciousness collapse physical matter, even baked into how we describe that is still the Cartesian split of mind and matter, which is not found in these notions. In kind of animistic perspectives, a object is barely an object, but it has an interiority. So the dreams are in your head. They're like, there is a sort of infinitely dense subjective, in Aboriginal cultures, at least some of them, it's called the dreaming. So they don't have things like empty space. The interiority of the non-human is taken, and it should be taken as a priori true, because otherwise you'll notice in the other belief systems, we kind of have these redirects, like a heart bypass or a traffic bypass, to get that idea back into our words that have mind and matter split. So what is the role of consciousness? I think when big table animism happens, so when animism is sitting at the big table, anytime you hear the word consciousness, you're more right than wrong to just swap it out with spirit. Because we're still squeamish about spirits. We're still squeamish about there being spirits. And obviously animism isn't. And I think it's a more legitimate word because it's a better match to, proven Fortean and UFO and whatever phenomena than consciousness, which is kind of stuck describing itself. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, obviously. I'm saying there are potentially better words within an animist model for it. But if you consider the function of consciousness in the kind of spiritual descriptions of the world, you can kind of swap it out with spirit and you get a bit closer to how I think, because obviously the premium members and I are kind of going on this project of defining the bounds of big table animism. So we're not there yet. But for the purposes of listening to this, that would be it. It would be swap the word consciousness with spirit whenever you want to use the word consciousness and see if it describes your experience and reality a bit better, and you'll start to kind of feel at the edges of what it is we're looking for.
All right, so how would you define spirit then?
Well, you get in that circular. I would describe it as the interiority of the universe. So this is kind of one of the ideas that you can lift from. You can kind of lift from animist cultures around the world, which is that it's ever present and we're embedded in it, but it's also the interiority of your body and the interiority of sacred objects and the interiority of sacred rivers and so on. It's what we experience with our consciousness, to use this term here in a phenomenological sense. If you go, you encounter a mountain or a river, and all of a sudden you have that sense of its personality and its mood and whatever it happens to be, or places might feel creepy or may resonate with you. The language used to describe that, because again, you think, well, what is happening? And you jump back onto, oh, that's in my head. And you go, but is it? Is it in your head? Because that's that Cartesian split. It's in my head because it can't be in the river, because the river is a clock. It's part of this giant dead clock, which isn't true. So that's where spirit is. It's in the interiority of physical experience. In a kind of, when I said is an ecosystem one thing or many things, the general idea is to conceptualize the universe in a way that Dr. Sheldrake may actually like, which is as a evolving either organism or ecosystem. And it's both, and it's whether you think an ecosystem is one thing or many things. Like the numbers don't really work if you're talking about the universe. And it's all is one, that kind of monism that people in spiritual communities tend to fall back on, is a sort of lazy solve that was tabled at around the same time, a bit earlier actually, in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a solve for, if there is a God, how come there are many things? So the solve for the one and many, lazily, is, well, maybe it's all one and we're just too stupid to see it. Now, we have in the 21st century, thanks to things like biology, a better understanding of kind of like the use of numbers and complexity and systems theory, so that you don't actually need to bundle it up. And if you bundle it up, you bundle it into an ecosystem which doesn't really have a number.
Right. Well, it's, I think that philosophy of language and the way you describe that sort of shows how language can sort of reinforce particular paradigms, and moving from one word to a different word can help the mind shift in particular ways. So I do appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's literally magic. Humankind has been, if you consider that everywhere that has literate culture, the story is it was given to us by demons. So everywhere that wrote things down, if it came from Thoth in Egypt, if it came from actual demons in Babylonia, wherever you go that you find the written word, you go, here's this tremendously powerful tool. But tools given to you by demons tend to come with fine print and written language, and even the sort of symbolic language that humans use and not very other animals do, all appear to be gifts from the spirit world that come with fine print, which is, it's immensely powerful, and you can get into space with this, but also it can mess up your authentic experience. And I think we've always known that. I think we've always known that it's a very dangerous tool, worthwhile, but very often used improperly. It's something we all do.
All right, so moving on. I mean, you talked about, my experience has just been awareness or consciousness, right? Like I tend to fall back on literally what my experience is. I don't experience matter. I'm not matter. I experience matter. I'm just having this conscious experience where there's all these layers of truth and realities that sort of mix into the one experience. And I'm certainly not promoting solipsism or anything like that. But that's what my experience is. It's awareness, it's consciousness, or spirit, depending on the way what terms you want to use. But part of that, my practice around magic is altered states of consciousness. For over a decade, I've been practicing pretty advanced meditation. I slip into meditative states pretty easily. I can literally feel it in my brain. It sort of lights up. It feels like on fire. The corpus callosum's very, very prominent. I can really feel the strength of it all. But that wasn't just due to meditation. It was many things, including experiences with plant medicines and psychotropics, general psychotropics. What else is there? There's dreaming. There's ancient techniques such as drumming, and dancing's been a massive one on in my experience. I don't know how many times I've been on that dance floor and levitated on some sort of level. It's just, and that's where I feel more powerful in terms of that practice. So I guess the question is there something that is there a practice that sort of suits your that assists you best in terms of practicing magic in terms of an altered state, and in general, is there practices to facilitate altered states which tend to work really well for people, or is it a very individual experience?
Well, it's always been a big part of my practice. The premium members actually just finished up a journeying course. We do a different course each quarter, so it was kind of looking at the technology of that over time. And I think I'm very much with you on the drug-altered dance experience, for instance. But I mean, I haven't done them since I got back to Australia, but I'm wildly pro the appropriate use of entheogens as I call it in Chaos Protocols, becoming invincible, which is just having that experience that makes you realize that just to your bones that materialism is not correct, and you'll never sort of backslide into it. It's a transformative tool used correctly in that sense. But on a day-to-day basis, yes, I've always been very responsive to the dream state. So I've, since being a kid, followed up on dream experiences and had profound ones, and generally recorded them, and I wouldn't say the lucid dreaming thing where you sort of wake up multiple times and so on is not for me. I'm a difficult enough sleeper as it is, so I think I'm halfway there. But I've used dream supplementation and so on as a general practice to go into, and again, you sort of which we encountered when we just finished up this course, which is still available if people are interested. You immediately come up against the challenges of all the different words that we have to describe it. So, and they typically are associated with technology. So you have electrical astral plane models in the 19th century as cities in Europe were being electrified and so on. But again, you go back to cultures like the Runa Puma, who Dr. Eduardo Cohen described in his book How Forests Think, which is life-changing. The dream world is the same as the world you journey to, and is also the kind of shadow side or other side of this. So it's, again, coming back to that interiority, so that the forest has a dream state baked into it. So when you dream of being in the forest, you're in that forest. And the reason it looks different is if you cross the kind of realms or dimensions, it appears metaphoric, but when you're in it, it appears literal. So waking state for us appears literal because we're in it. But the dream state appears metaphoric because we're in the literal state. But if you're a spirit, the literal world that we live in looks metaphoric because it's about crossing that divide. So I have sort of regular journeying practices that are kind of neo-shamanic, like as I was talking to the guys, in a very Michael Harner sense, where you sort of lie down, do the breathing exercises, relax, have some kind of white noise, drumming or whatever you want, anything to kind of block out that world, and then, you know, leave the body or visit whatever you want to conceptualize the realm as. That's always been a huge part of my practice, and I think it's very important, I think it's very important for people to kind of Goldilocks their way through different systems of journeying in that macro sense before they find one that works for them. And even if it's just doing something in response to having a profound dream experience, which is also commonly observed in more animistic cultures. Again, it's very difficult, as you know, to talk about Australian Aboriginal culture because you're dealing with, you know, a few dozen different separate nations. But on a broad level, you will find occasionally in Aboriginal cultures that upon waking, the Aborigine in question will, if they've had an interesting dream experience, will compose a song about it or have some sort of ritualized action as a result. And that lets the rest of the non-human world, so the birds and the billabong and whatever, know that here is a person of renown who operates in both worlds. And I think that's actually what Carl Jung did when he created, in secret, his Red Book, because he was going into the dream state and coming back out and physicalizing the experience. And there is something about anchoring it into the literal or the waking or whatever you want to call it, be it a dream or a journey, that makes it work better. And by better, I mean it literally makes it work better. Your life transforms by doing this. So it doesn't matter what it is. People, we've had like, obviously it's contingent on people's different personality types, and in the premium members there are some who are more visual and some who are less visual, and you just kind of have to develop a way, because I do think in a big table animism world you are you in the dream state, and it is just as quote unquote real as this state. It's just on a different part of the spectrum. So it seems like however you want to do it, you have the responsibility to, I guess, assert sovereignty over yourself in that state as well as this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in a process at the moment of trying to reinvigorate the experience of dreaming in my life. I had a huge run of it when I was in my early to mid-20s, lots of lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, very, very powerful stuff. But as I sort of moved on, I realized I wasn't conscious enough to really understand what I needed to create for myself, as well as to give back within that greater grid. And so, and then suddenly my dream sort of stopped, and it's more evolved into sort of day visions, especially now. At the moment, I have just these moments where it's just like a huge download and upload of information. I'm having this exchange of energy or exchange of spirit with the physical and non-physical realms. And you talk.
Well, I'm going to interrupt there because you have the experience. So Jung could do that. So he had profound dream experiences and nightmares as a child and a young adult and so on. But when he was doing the Red Book, he got so good at it that he could sit at his desk and get into that state and just be transcribing, almost like automatic writing. But he was, of course, conscious. He could be in both realms at the one time, and he had lots of experience, and so do you, Phil. So that makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because you mentioned your experience being neo-shamanic, and I talked about this on your podcast when I was on there probably a couple of months ago now, 3 months ago. And how it evolved for me is that I started to realise that this human tribe is starting to develop, regardless of all these cultural and ethnicity and religious and ideological differences. And what I was doing was contributing to a collective shaman role, because there's not one person who can manage the human tribe. So I feel like there's like all these different people who are almost like Power Rangers, and they've all got they might be conscious or unconscious of the experience, but they're contributing to this, how the Power Rangers get together and they create the big one, and that's this sort of not esoteric, more like a metaphysical representation of all that sort of energy doing what needs to be done for the healing and the development of the tribe. And that's how I sort of realized that I'm not really, as I realized I wasn't smart enough or conscious enough to understand what I needed to do, I just started using that universal language and the universal intent and taking away my sort of bias around what I think needs to be done. And what the intention that I literally do is just, this is for what's best for the healing and the development of both myself, because I'm the micro, and the macro, which is the human tribe and beyond. So when you mentioned, because I don't think I'm a neo-shaman. I think I'm contributing to this neo-shamanism, which is obviously there's many definitions of neo-shamanism. It's one of those words that's very unique to each person experiencing this sort of stuff. So I guess I just wanted to touch back on what you meant for your personal experience when you felt it was very neo-shamanistic in that experience.
Well, I meant it specifically. So the kind of late 60s, mostly 70s shamania, if you want, with Carlos Castaneda and Michael Hanna and so on, relied on some now subsequently really problematic opinions of non-white cultures and frankly an appropriation of stuff. This is the quintessential dreamcatcher era, and nevertheless, and also because as we've discussed, because we both grew up in the same town, Newcastle, Australia, in the late 80s and early 90s wasn't exactly known as a hotbed of esoteric books. So when I was starting on these journeys, these were the books they had. There was, the old Michael Hanna books and so on, which I read and dutifully did the exercises in them, even though I certainly don't identify. People can. It's like everything has a weird historical context. So the emergence of the Golden Dawn happened in high imperial London, and it involved appropriation of what the British idea of Indian belief systems were, and so it's kind of an imperial artifact. In the same way, Michael Hanna isn't racist, right? But formulating his, he would probably formulate shamanism as a system differently today than how we thought about non-white cultures in the 60s and 70s. Nevertheless, the techniques work. So, and it's just that I did that. I've been journeying since I was 14. It turned out I was quite good at it. It was one of the early books I read. And it's just that in that very chaos magic sense, well, this tech works for me. So even though I'm not at all associated with that as a world, the tech still works. And I've carried it. I'm 36 now. So I've been using that tech for 22 years. So in that sense, it's neo-shamanic. Like I'm pretty sure I read it in a Michael Hanna book, my first initial descriptions of how one might journey. So that's what I mean. The cosmology, I know exactly what you mean about, I would describe it differently. My redescription of your exact same experience, the kind of rune soup mission is the re-enchantment of the world. And when you were talking about Power Rangers and kind of people waking up, I experience that as coming from the spirit world in. So there are a number of non-human persons, typically, some of them including Dark Age European saints, which we've forgotten, but also ayahuasca herself appears to be on a mission. Like, if you want something done, do it yourself. And there is this kind of, because we're both permaculture nerds, right? These pioneer or mineral accumulator species that are coming through to improve the soil so that the authentic can grow again. And that's absolutely my experience. And there are people, and the kind of point of having a premium membership model for Rune Soup is to trigger trophic cascades in people's lives around the world. So in your case, it would be, to wake up Power Rangers all over the world, because you really, like, one awake person has a flow-on effect to the sort of 150 people around them. And I'm sure people listening to the show are that person in their group of 150. You're the person they ring when you have a parent that's seriously ill, or that you have a weird dream experience. You're actually fulfilling that function. Most people listening to this would be it. And we need loads more of them, Phil. And I don't care. I obviously don't care at all what system people operate in to fulfill that function, to be the pioneer species that changes the kind of, the metaphoric soil of Western culture. I do not care what it is, just definitely do it.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's great representation of the sort of individual roles that we sort of do have, because some people are just naturally more skilled at a certain form of magic or whatever it may be. They've got certain personality traits and they've got certain strengths and certain weaknesses, but that can also be developed over time. You can develop your weaknesses, you can amplify your strengths, and all that's in the context of neurological, cosmological, astrological, philosophical, the spiritual type essence that we're sort of built upon. And so absolutely, it's really important that people sort of connect with who they are and what their sort of more natural roles might be. And it's funny because, I'm 36 as well, Gordon, and we're very kindred on this path, but we've got, as we've discussed, different terms, different ways of describing it, different experiences within it. And that's perfectly natural. And I think,
absolutely.
I don't think people should be projecting what it needs to be for each individual person. But as long as we're sort of, basing some of our unity on principles and values and some of that good philosophical stuff, then we can just tailor that to suit our own experience and contribute back in whatever ways that we see fit. All right, so you talked about the re-enchantment of the world. My fiance, she loves that word, enchantment. So do I. There's just some sort of magical essence about it, and that we're going through cycles. You talk about going through a cycle of that re-enchantment process, but also about the collapse of the current system, and moving. I don't know if you reference it in sort of terms of the fourth turning, that sort of idea, but you do talk about cycles. What do you predict in terms of both of that, the good stuff, the re-enchantment of the world, but also, and I know it's very hard to predict, I probably shouldn't have used that word, but the re-enchantment of the world and the demise of the current status quo, how do you see that unfolding in a general sense?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm absolutely a cycles theorist, and one of the more interesting things that's happened in the last few years is more and more economists like Tyler Cohen and so on have kind of realized it's the model that Europeans lived under for 1,500 years was essentially a cycle model, because it was planting to do with moon and seasons and so on. So the cycle describes the universe, and then we get to materialist industrialization, and everything is this kind of march of progress where that reaches its peak in Victorian London, and all cultures are on a kind of development path into that, and they're just further back. And that kind of idea that you could end a business cycle. So the one thing, we get to the end of the 20th century and everything in the world and the universe is a cycle except for the business cycle, which is in fact a steady march of progress and increasing capitalist wealth. That's not correct. And we've now had sort of 15 years of very interesting data crunching going back historically the whole way. So people like David Graeber, looking at the history of money and debt going back to Babylon and Sumer, have demonstrated that there's a business cycle. And a business cycle is not surprising because we're embedded in a cyclical universe. And we're at a point where this end of the cycle is fast approaching. And that's manifested in the dismal politics we see around the West and the kind of ultra centralization of wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands. And
the collapse of values and virtue.
Yeah. Yeah, this is what happens at this point. And interestingly, at previous points, and this is why I like the pioneer species metaphor for people like us, it's collapsed the soil. Like the soil is collapsed. And in that situation is when you get your dandelions and you get the pioneer species showing up. So it's not surprising that magic and witchcraft is now a visual motif in Vogue magazine and so on, because this is what happens at the end of a cycle as this thing goes away. Unfortunately, this time around, because of the level of power and technology and money involved in the people whose game is up, they're probably not going to... It's probably not going to end nicely because typically humans don't relinquish power once they have it. So between now and, using Martin Armstrong's model, for instance, between now and 2032, when Beijing, rather than China, and that's a crucial difference, becomes the financial capital of the world, we have to move through different systems that may involve fewer stars on the flag in the US and China, maybe more than one country and so on. And there are a couple of ways we can get there. There's a gross militaristic war way, or there's the rocky but non-violent decentralization, because that's the counter trend to centralization is decentralization, and that's what's coming. And how those two things overlap as centralization hands off to decentralization is the question. We can do it nice or rough, to paraphrase Tina Turner. And I'm not sure which one it's going to be, but that the countervailing trend has asserted itself. And in the medium term, it's much, much better. In the short term, it manifests as things like people voting for Donald Trump, or like the revulsion at the way the system is going has meant that people will cast around for literally anything to bring it to an end. And so in the short term, it's probably not great. But in the medium term, a decentralizing direction is much better than a centralizing one.
Yeah, we talked about a bit of that on the podcast when I was on Rune Soup. And I've heard you mention benign sedition, the benign sedition approach of permaculture, and just growing your own food and increasing, food security and sovereignty both on an individual and a community basis. And if there is any chaos, any serious chaos that does unfold due to what's going on, then I think it's probably a safe bet to make sure that you've got some of those basic needs sorted out.
Yeah, and it's also it's just a better way of living, as you know. So that was something Bill Mollison said when he was asked to describe, who founded permaculture, as you know. He was asked to describe permaculture. He said it was a benign form of sedition.
He said that, right? Okay.
Yes, and if you look at his career prior to he and Dave Holmgren creating permaculture, he had all kinds of jobs. You know, he worked with the CSIRO. He was a lecturer. He was a fisherman. He was, worked in the logging industry in Tasmania and so on. So he'd seen, he'd had enough interactions with the bureaucratic class to realize that no help and no solution is going to come from that kind of gaggle of fools. And so you either burn the whole thing down, which is, or have open revolt, which is sedition. That's like the actual legal term for it. Or you have benign sedition, which is, do you know what? I'm just going to be over here. You guys go nuts. And I thought it was just in that kind of gnomic Bill way, just such a really profound way of describing it. And it is a more authentic way of living. And it's what it's a decentralized trend. It's another manifestation of why permaculture is so popular at the moment and why people are so interested in where their food comes from, because they're pulling away from and turning away from this centralized industrial process that has kind of defined their experience for the previous 70 years.
Yeah, another type of, now just thinking about it, benign form of sedition is just basically unplugging yourself from the matrix to the best of your capacity and just doing it in a loving way to yourself and everyone else, and just going, well, it's not just food. I'm gonna really enjoy my life. I'm gonna get out in nature. I'm gonna experience the world. I'm gonna give back as best I can, and without that hatred or anguish. And don't be wrong, there's a place for anger. We're all on the emotional spectrum, and it can help to drive passion, etc. But to live in that space consistently and feed that back out into the universe probably isn't helpful. But yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is, even though the cycles are moving through and we're not going to stop it, is there still a place for like a type of activism, not just in your own life, like literally being that change, but also, the sharing information and whatever it may be, providing, helping people to become more conscious around particular areas?
I think that's the only activism. If you look at, especially given that things like the Bolsheviks were funded by London and Wall Street and so on, like if you look at historical attempts at revolution, they don't end well because you end up becoming the thing that you were trying to get rid of. And this is a kind of post-computing systems and chaos theory realization, and it comes back to the ecosystem as the best model, I think, for the universe. Centralized systems, even if you try to centralize it around yourself as, I'll be a wise king, I won't be Stalin. Yeah, you will. The trend has to be decentral, because like centralization in an ecosystem is a blue-green algal bloom. Like it's monoculture. So it is the only activism. And that's kind of why I use the trophic cascade metaphor for people who are waking up, because it's based on the observation of what happened in 1995 when Yellowstone National Park introduced 12 wolves back in. It's not enough to actually, for effective predation on all the deer and stuff that was in there, but the smell of the wolves moved the deer off the hills. And so the trees started growing back, which brought in birds, which brought in more species that built the soil so that the water running into the rivers was clear, so that the salmon came back, so that the bears came back, so that, beavers started building dams, and it's the smell of 12 wolves, and the entire thing decentralizes. And that is the activism. That's how you wake someone up, and you have that experience in your life. Because in that post, I think you referenced where I quote Bill as describing permaculture as a benign form of sedition. I kind of came on that post because I was trying to describe what the difference between permaculture and prepping is. And permaculture can't work unless it's embedded in local networks. It's built for it. It is built for interaction with, and by local network, that can also be people who are further away who see the world the way you do. Whereas prepping is a kind of billionaire building a bunker in New Zealand and stocking it with guns and canned food and actually walling him or herself off, realistically him, from the world ending. Permaculture is a decentralized way that embeds in local systems. So that was where I was going with it, and I think that is the only activism. I mean, you can write your senator as much as you want. They will still revolving door into big pharma and big agri and military companies when they're done with their time spending your tax dollars bombing innocent people in other countries. Like, there's nothing good comes from that centralized direction. And so I guess the good news is that ends, but the bad news is that ends. And if you're not ready for it, it might get a little rocky. So decentralize, find the others. That is the activism.
And look, I think there's a place for all, if you're contributing back in any way that suits, including writing a letter to your senator. I hear what you're saying. There's probably going to be no impact, but you're also doing that action and putting that back out and that sort of adds a little bit to the momentum of that the expansion of consciousness process. And like, for example, I know the mayor quite well here in Belgium, and I'm in talks with him multiple levels around this sort of stuff. And will it result in some, pretty significant change? Probably not, but it's still a process.
No, see, a mayor is the appropriate level. So a senator, when you're centralizing it into a sort of federal level, it's too centralized. That's the game, and it has been corrupt the entire time. Mayor, that's local network stuff. Absolutely do that. I joined the Greens Party a couple of months ago here, and I'm not that happy with how they operate at a federal level at all. But they're excellent at council level interaction, which is why I joined. So that is the activism. That's kind of do the local network interaction. So congratulations on you and the mayor for going along that road.
Well, he's quite a conscious person, so that's always quite re-inspiring. I met a school teacher here at Belgian High School just recently, and she talked about garden programs being incorporated into the system. I think more on a state level, which is great. There are some good things that sort of happen that you sort of don't really tap into. I also talked about do you have a dominant philosophy in your science classes that you dogmatically inject into those poor little kids, or are you open about it? You talk about quantum physics, you talk about all these other things like simulation theory, etc. And I got a very surprising series of answers, and obviously it's from teacher to teacher. Bias always comes through depending on the individual person. But yeah, she really showed that she's quite conscious in the way that she's helping her kids to explore science and its associated philosophical implications. So, and then, for example, a friend of mine in Newcastle, her child goes to a preschool, and they were teaching meditation and mindfulness for the kids in preschool. I mean, there's all these great things that are sort of happening, especially when teachers are sort of just doing it themselves. They're sort of operating under, guided by the curriculum, but also, having their own tangents and helping kids to explore different concepts as well. So, so it's just great to hear these little stories. There is a lot happening that does sort of inspire us, and we need to...
Yeah. Things aren't as bad. It's a turning. It will turn again. Like, this is how cycle models work. You absolutely don't despair. Even though things are going to get rocky, there is good stuff going on. I agree completely.
Yeah. All right. Talking about cycles, and I know we've gone over time, so I'm hoping you're right to bear with me. But there's the suggestion that the sun is going through a grand cycle, potentially into a grand solar minimum, which might make temperatures colder, and potentially even a mini ice age over the next sort of decade or so. Is that something that you've studied?
Yeah, I do follow that, and I think what has happened, and again, permaculturist Green Party member, so hopefully people won't take this the wrong way. What's happened with environmentalism and its weaponization by the UN and other Rockefeller interests is that we have, in the last 20 or 30 years, destroyed any hope of having, and I think it's probably quite urgent, clean climate science. And so from the early 80s on, the impact of anything that wasn't humans has been removed, which is really dumb. Like, that's really bad science, especially as the sun is the sun. So I think that's going to really surprise people. We're planning for, even though the models are 0% accurate, we're planning for some kind of dramatic rise in the next 15 years. And we need to be open to the idea, because we just don't know, because we've ruined the science, which parts of it are, cosmic rays, which parts of it are the sun, which parts of it are whatever you want. So yes, I'm interested in whether or not that will happen.
Yeah, it's certainly, as you said, wise to prepare in a permaculture sense for just anything, really.
Well, funny enough, because I completed my course earlier this year, and some of the questions, it was an online course through Jeff Lawton, obviously, and some of the questions people asked were, how do you mitigate against climate change? And it was very interesting to see, given permaculture's background, how the interns and people that Jeff had working on the course have changed their tune in the last 15 years, which is essentially, look, in the worst case scenario, it's a 2-degree difference. If you build your permaculture system correctly,
it won't matter.
It literally doesn't matter. Humans grow, from the Arctic to the equator. If you build a robust and resilient system, the idea, and it's very interesting that who people I consider to be the world experts in how you grow correctly are the ones who are, I'm not saying least concerned about climate change, but they're ones who have, I think, the greatest awareness of how plants and biological systems will respond to the worst case scenario, which is the worst case scenario rather than the most likely. So this is another example of the good news, which is, my goodness, don't, the sky doesn't have to fall, put it that way.
Absolutely. Now, just to go back to your decentralisation point, as I said, we did speak about that on the podcast when I visited you, was a guest with you. And it's so important. I'm just thinking about decentralising an individual life. I mean, if you're stuck in an urbanised enslavement centre and you're not enjoying it, try and get out to a smaller community. If you're stuck with if you're in the big banking system, try and get out to, a more local bank or credit union that acts more in alliance with community, with providing community benefits. There's many ways to decentralise. Don't participate in particular corporations. Where you get your food, try and get it locally. Try and get it off, people who are trying to just, provide fresh, local, nutrition-dense, energetically abundant food. Get involved with that. There's just, it's so important, as you said, that the response to centralisation is naturally going to be decentralisation, and if we contextualise that within the natural law and individual and community sovereignty, we can start enacting changes in our own lives which contribute to that shift. I actually talk about it in my book called The Simulation, which I'll be releasing over the next couple of months, hopefully. And I've got a few ideas for which is a novel. It's just a fictional tale, but laced with truth bombs and just a good, engaging read. But I do talk about ideas of centralisation in that. So if anybody's interested, keep your eye out for that. And I want to go back to, before we go, there's a couple of key questions that I want to make sure I touch on because it might be on a lot of people's minds. So you talked about the demon creation. I can't remember the exact words, so my apologies for that. But it sort of made me think of Gnosticism and the role of the false god compared to the creator god or the real god. I know you have a lot of Gnostic advocates on your podcast, and I'm pretty sure it's a part of the way that you philosophize as well. So can you explain to the audience what Gnosticism is and how you relate to it personally?
Well, Gnosticism's another one of those academic umbrella terms, which is still, it's kind of useful, but you can't look back in history and find, Gnosticism in the same way that you can find Catholicism or the Temple of Ra or something. It is a collection of what are now considered heretical, largely Christian, although it actually predates Christianity. So it begins, I think, with heretical Judaism in the Eastern Mediterranean conception of the universe, which is things aren't great here, basically. And it has long been a challenging solve for philosophers as to why bad things happen. Why is it shit here? And the Gnostic solution, they kind of box themselves into a corner to some extent, but there is a lot of wisdom in it nonetheless, is the universe, the physical universe, can't be the creation of a perfect God because it's awful here. And we are separated from our true spiritual home, the pleroma, so like the God above God, the ultimate creative source, by an interesting creative, an act of creation that was performed by lesser versions that have kind of either split off from him or are in open rebellion to him. And so we have the physical world in some Gnostic schools as a prison trapping our soul essence, which is a fragment of that original God above God, from returning, and it, like the demiurge, so the creator of the universe, or the physical world anyway, being essentially harvesting that energy from us. So you get different versions. They're all different solves for the fact that it's not great here, and how does that work if there is a creator God? And one of the things that I think is very useful about Gnosticism is it provides you with a map for thinking about, because some of it's actually very positive, having gone with the whole described it as a prison and so on.
Well, there's some Gnostic thinkers and streams that are more on the fence with it. It's both positive and negative. Right?
Yeah, it's more like it's a description of reality in a dispassionate sense, in the same way that, you know, you can be a shark biologist and be studying the shark from the boat, but if you fall in, you're thinking of the shark very differently. Like, you know, so you kind of have, it's just the way of things, that the physical world is created by a specific God that isn't the true God of all things. And that idea is actually very Egyptian. So you have demiurge means maker. And Gnosticism, as a result, has different techniques of waking people up. So it's kind of what we're talking about, kind of like the Power Ranger thing. This would have been how they would describe it. Have different meditational and prayer, and some, I would speculate, and I think I can justify this, even use of entheogens to essentially have people have a profound experience that makes them realize that the physical is not all there is. And it's really, really interesting stuff. The Gnostic Gospels have some of my favorite kind of sayings attributed to Jesus, and it almost gets a bit ancient alien. So in the Gospel of Thomas, you have Jesus saying essentially, the bird has its nest, the fox has its hole, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, which is the Jesus way of saying, you're not from here. And I like that. It's very useful. I think in some respects, and this comes back to the big table animism model, I think in some respects everything is from here, because if you conceptualize it as either an evolving organism or one ecosystem, we are in some respects from here, even if we spend more time in the non-physical than the physical. So I kind of describe it as a map rather than the territory, because it's a very good one for giving you, for helping you assign priorities, I suppose. And also there's just a lot of wisdom and a way of understanding how bad things can happen in the world, and how to sort of just walk away from the outrageous and ultimately in the long term pointless upset over terrestrial politics.
Yeah, so personally I'm attracted to the Gnostic philosophy, but damn, I know how to be reverent and be in awe with the beauty and magic of this world as well. So
that's the bit, like map rather than territory. And I get why they did it. Like if you can imagine at the time, particularly if you have diaspora Jews in Alexandria who have just seen the Second Temple collapse after the temple elite were complicit with the Romans, and then you get to Alexandria and you have the same thing. You have foreign remote leaders running the world. No one speaks Egyptian, and it's an Egyptian city, and you look at it and go, this place is run by demons. And you can understand why they came to that conclusion, right? But as with you, I think it's a very good map, but it very much falls away in the presence of animate nature, and you think there's no way that this is evil.
Well, that's duality, isn't it? You know,
exactly.
So yeah, look, for those who want to learn more about Gnosticism, there's plenty of podcasts. Check out some of Gordon's Rune Soup podcasts and interviews as well. And you've no doubt been introduced it through movies such as The Matrix. I think even things like some of the new animations like the Lego movie have Gnostic overtones or foundations to it. I think you describe Dude, Where's My Car as a Gnostic movie. Is that correct?
I said it's the most Gnostic movie ever. The Gnostics were very interested in where they came from, because if we're here, what are we doing in this awful place? And that's essentially Dude, Where's My Car? Because they had all these techniques of trying to work out. They were fascinated with the Genesis story. So they're Old Testament. Like, how did this happen? And so they're kind of ancient aliens theorists. They're like, what made us and what are we doing here? And they get these flashes of really bizarre things that happen on their way back home, which is literally the story of Dude, Where's My Car? My favorite proper Gnostic movie, if people haven't seen it, and not many people have, is called The Nines. And that's worth seeking out if you're interested in this kind of stuff.
Oh, well, I've got a new movie for the list because I haven't seen them up myself. So, all right, excellent. One final question. There is obviously males and females are different. There's a whole process at the moment, like where there's this gender neutral scenario, but when we're talking about sex, males with who have male reproductive organs, females have female reproductive organs. Obviously, there's some people in between that, and that's separate itself. But there are physiological differences, including in the brain, between males and females. I'm very aware that we're on the spectrum of estrogen to testosterone. A lot of people in the middle, and that's where they're more likely to be bisexual or to experience other sexuality identities. Some are more at the extreme ends, like myself. I think I've got a lot of testosterone in myself. You can see it in my chin and in my tone. But we're all a bit different. But there are some fundamental differences between males and females. Let's just cut to the chase on it. Do you think that there are some more naturally magical capacities for males versus females, or do you think that it's just really an individual experience and it all sort of that spectrum contributes to that individuality?
Well, I probably wouldn't be very good at pregnancy or birth magic. So obviously there is. Probably not as many as you might think, given that the things that magic can be used for are very foundational and are to do with things like perception, and even though we've kind of talked around that word, consciousness. So probably not as many as you might think. So it may express itself as probability enhancement for hunters, which is in most cultures a majority male, although not all, a majority male behavior. And obviously things to do with childbirth and fertility tend to be more on the female side of things. So if you mean, and actually I kind of anecdotally think this anyway, but that's more a personal experience thing. If you mean that women are potentially, might be better at kind of more herbal magic or more classically witchy things, to be honest, that hasn't been my experience of the magical community. So I expect there are differences. I don't think they manifest in too many different skills. I mean, going back to Australian Aborigines, Australian Aboriginal women are master hunters and fishermen and so on. So they have hunting and fishing songs and what have you. But going backwards, not that I know, but I'd be surprised if there were Aboriginal male pregnancy songs. So it might be exclusively, if you were looking for the differences, I would locate them around things like pregnancy and childbirth rather than anywhere else, would be my guess, I would say. It's a good question.
Mate, I love that answer. I love how you describe the childbirth as magic. It's used a lot. The mystery of childbirth, and it's talked about in the lexicon of mainstream discussion, but it's not really understood as actual magic. And I think that's a really good way to wrap this up. We're talking about the magic is very, very natural. We're all participating in it. Some of us are more conscious about that process or the various processes than others, but we certainly can develop our understanding and our practice as we evolve. If we want to evolve, we certainly can. We're all got our individual roles. We're all a instrument of sound in the orchestra of reality, and we're all putting out our sound, our music into the greater grid, and we're sort of tuning together, we're evolving together. Hopefully you've got a good attitude while you're experiencing it and trying to, and really in relishing in that magic and the beauty of this experience, because I know a lot of it's dire. When you look at the control system, it can be a very scary place to sit your mind and your heart in. And you need to have that balance in duality. You need to look at the spiritual, the beautiful, the magical, and just the stuff around connection with yourself and the world at large. So, Gordon, before you go, is there any final thoughts you've got? Anything that I missed in terms of places people can connect with you and follow your work?
No, I think it's all good. Runesoup.com is everything. You'll find Runesoup on Facebook and so on as well, but that's the place to go.
Well, Gordon, really appreciate your time. This has been a pleasurable chat. I look forward to meeting up with you in person over the next month or so, and I can't wait to do this again.
Nice one. Thank you.